first speaker is Mr. Kooistra. And
Kooistra.
if you have not stopped the Montana, Billings Western Heritage Museum, do so. It's fun just to go into that old building. There's more stuff there, but the old building's thing. So he's going to talk about the south side of Billings. How many people have been to the south side of Billings? On the wrong side of the track?
Yes.
Whoa.
Right side, right? Huh.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to say anything more. This is going to be good.
This is a little secret I'll share with all my history friends out here. I've learned to set my alarm in my pocket so I get electric shocks after 20 minutes. And plus, out of the courtesy of the speaker following today. So I'm going to talk a little about the Southsiders project. I'm going to just give you a glimpse of our work. 10 years ago, we realized if you split the city in half, which it did, half of Billings was the civic side to the north side. The south side had an amazing history that was underrepresented in our collections, including through photographs and oral histories. So we made a concerted effort. We found an amazing community partner in Healthy by Design out of Riverstone Health. And from your research, oral histories, scanned family photographs of African-American neighbors, Hispanic, German from Russian families. We acquired collections through their graciousness. We built an in-house exhibit. We built a traveling exhibit. We built an online exhibit. We also helped participate in a sidewalk poetry program and did public programs like this. And also created walking tours. So the neighbors themselves, the one example I have up there are the neighbors themselves dictated what they wanted to share in their history of South Park and also Highland Park on the south side of Billings. So the neighbors actually created these walking tours for us. And I'm going to talk a little about that and share some of that representative work. If you're not familiar with Billings, 1882, the Northern Pacific Railway plats the city of Billings, and it has a very unusual design. The 2 square miles right there are odd numbered sections that were controlled by the railroad. Now, normally that's not how the world would look, but our baseline for survey across the state of Montana runs there. So the 2 odd numbered sections controlled by the railroad actually overlap. And then the railroad basically did what they were doing in the 1870s and 1880s, which was basically slice a railroad track through the middle of those sections. And so once you do that, you create what I call the tale of 2 cities. In Billings, for example, the railroad depot was placed on the north side of the tracks, therefore favoring the north side for civic development. The south side has a little different story, which is our focus today, and that also has to play in with which direction the wind blows. So if you split your city in half, you focus the north side on civic development, things like the county courthouse and the city hall. The south side and the way the wind blew, which in the summer from west to east, if you think about if you turn your city into 4 quads, the southeast quadrant would then be reserved for industrial. And you can still see that in Billings today. The feedlots, the oil and gas industry, and important in this talk is, of course, the sugar beet factory, which was located just below South Park here toward the bottom. And like I said, these are underrepresented communities in our history, and hopefully we've done some justice by bringing some of these stories. So the south side of Billings, south of the railroad tracks, would early on be identified with concentrated populations of Chinese and African Americans, as well as a Japanese colony. The local prostitution or restricted district was concentrated on 5 blocks of Minnesota Avenue on Billings South Side from 1890 to 1920. Matter of fact, there's a newspaper article that said, we saw a prostitute on Montana Avenue north of the tracks. You can either leave town or cross the tracks. So it was quite a moneymaker at the time for the police department. So with Billings' growing population from 1900 to 1910, our population tripled. The state actually required a state board for parks to establish at 10,000. So we had created a state board or a parks board in 1908. And matter of fact, So once that established, it will play into what I'm going to talk about here too. The sugar factory was established in 1906, 1907, which of course would require immigrant labor. And those are two of the groups I'll be talking about, the Germans from Russia and also the Hispanic populations. One of the earliest populations, of course, in Billings and on the south side is our African-American community. And I'm pointing out this particular example because I have a letter I want to share with you. Walker Browning, who was born in Missouri, his son of a slave, his father was killed during the Civil War in active duty. And then he, as the eldest child, basically after his mother died, he took on all of his kids and they were traveling all over the West. Walker Browning was a cook for the Jones Expedition Survey at Yellowstone National Park in 1873. And in 1883, just a year after the establishment of Billings, Walker Browning and his family settled in the Billings area on the south side. The Billings Gazette wrote in 1894, "We have several men of color occupying lucrative positions of trust who own their own homes and are fairly in the pathway of affluence. The one number that stands out is the family of Mr. Walker Browning, and the accomplishments of his mother and daughters are credit to the community with which they reside." He was considered kind of the central figure of the south side of Billings. But I'm going to take you on a little side trip here and talk about, again, in the process of research, historians are a weird bunch, by the way. We all know that, right? When we found this letter, I think initially we went, whoop, like that. And then we read the letter and went, oh God, this is depressing. But it relates to the use of the South Park pool. Billings went through this incredible period of renovation, establishment of parks during the 19-teens and such. And South Park was established in 1914. And it's right at, right there on the south side, right in the middle of that neighborhood where a lot of the immigrants were coming in. And of course, the first day of the pool opened, the Gazette had an article that said colored folks could use the pool. So there must have already been some question. Unfortunately, they were refused bathing suits. So our Parks Board, in its wisdom at the time, said, wait, let's rethink this. Negroes may not use the pool. People of color may not use the pool. And so the reason I bring this up is this comes up a lot in the research we do, whether it's about Hazel Hunkins Hallinan, the suffragists, and being told to get off the sidewalks, you're a nuisance. Often it's under the guise for their own safety. So the Parks Board said there is no telling what might happen to a colored man using the pool, said one of the members of the Park Board. The city would have to put on extra large force to protect any who might, and even then it is questionable that they would be safe. So as I mentioned, Walker Browning, a prominent businessman, was the person basically denied access to the pool. But I'm going to read this letter because this, like I said, this letter just keeps coming up and it's very unusual. Walker Browning actually responded the next day in the newspaper. July 14, 1914. I cannot help but think that the discrimination against the colored people of Billings in not permitting them to use the new municipal pool and the criticism that arose incident to the setting aside of a day for them is extremely unjust to the law-abiding colored people of this community. I have been a resident of Billings for 32 years, have lived on the water from the Yellowstone River, and do not think it would be very seriously contaminated by a few of our people, human beings, whose chief desire would be a pleasant dip on a hot summer day. The talk of having to scour the pool after use by a colored man is hardly just. There is no known chemical that will make the skin change its color. Just because a man's skin is dark, is that a reason that he could be considered unclean? Do not forget that the red blood of the American Negro has flowed on the battlefields in defense of our flag, including his father, who died in the Civil War. And his bravery has been as great as that of the white man. Of all the races who have come to this country, none are more loyal than the colored man, who was brought here against his own will originally. We do not seek social equality. We do not want it, but we feel as though we are entitled to the rights of American citizenship, especially in the view of the fact that we have paid the taxes for the construction of the swimming pool, as well as other municipal improvements. We have souls the same as white men, hearts that beat as true, and ideals that reach as high. And we know that this discrimination is not going to stop the progress of the colored man. He has endured too many hardships already to ever want to go back. So again, it's one of those things where you read a letter like that when you're doing your research and your initial reaction is like, wow, that's awesome. And then, of course, the context, how we treat each other. But this plays into a theme that we actually learned as we were interviewing residents of the South Side. Councilman Jim Quillo, who was a Hispanic a sugar beet kid, basically. He says, as a minority, we couldn't swim at the pool. We could only swim there on Sundays. And this is in the 1950s. They wouldn't let African American or Mexican or minorities swim there because they would let the white people swim Monday through Saturday. And then they would let the colored people on Sunday so they could drain the water and put fresh water in it. Nellie Foster, an African-American woman, in her interview recalled that a neighbor, a James Dahlberg, who lived near the pool, actually built a concrete swimming pool in their yard and invited all the minority kids to swim in the pool in the 1950s. She said they could, though, swim at South Park on Sundays. As I mentioned, the Walkers, Ruth and Walker Browning, husband and wife, served as the influential voices of the African-American community. Walker helped establish the Maple Leaf Club, the Afro-American South Billings Club, all kind of exclusive social clubs for the African-American neighborhood. He was a distinguished member of the Eastern Montana Pioneers, and his wife, Ruth, participated in the Phyllis Wheatley Colored Women's Club and the Ladies' Aid of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they had two daughters. One, Claudia, would marry the war hero, Horace Bivens. Both died in the 1920s. So this is the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Billings South Side. It still does exist, but it hasn't been occupied since 1913. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was established in Billings in 1898. This building was built on the south side in 1921. It was occupied through 2013. The good news is, oh. Hello, batteries. I will scream now. Well, here's the good news on this project. Just recently, the pastor of the basically the church that represents a lot of the minorities on the south side is now engaged in terms of trying to get more interest and maybe potentially fixing the church up and reoccupying the church after all this time. A lot of these places, like for example, the Browning family ran boarding houses. Those buildings are gone now and they've been destroyed systematically. So there's not a lot left from these African-American communities. So when we ever get a chance, we're hoping that we can salvage some of these buildings, including the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So the women of the Billings African-American community use the Maple Leaf Club for meetings. This is for meetings of the Phyllis Wheatley Colored Women's Club. So this is one of the photographs that we got courtesy of Nellie Foster in our work on the South Side. And we have about 15 other photographs from her family representing her experience in growing up in Billings, in particular in the 1940s and 1950s. Can you still hear me? Okay. I come from a family of loud talkers in New Jersey. Every time I landed in the airport at Newark Airport, my dad would start saying, "Have you seen the latest episode of MASH?" Of course, being in Montana for a while, I'd be like, put my head down, embarrassed by it. But now I appreciate it as I'm getting older. I love people who are loud talkers, by the way. So really, a major influence on the South Side is the sugar beet factory. And that, of course, was brought to you by First, the Carry Land Act work that was going on, state recognized reclamation lands that created the Billings Heights and the city of Shepherd. And then right after that, the Huntley Project, which was a federally sponsored irrigation project. The large scale irrigation projects in the American West required an immigrant or migrant workforce. Donald Worcester noted, the historian Worcester noted, the families that came out to undeveloped irrigation projects in the cold, windswept plains of Montana had as hard a life as any farmer has faced in the 20th century. In many ways, their lot was harder, if simply by contrast of what was then available to them elsewhere, that of men and women on the earlier eastern frontier. So the sugar beet factory opens immediately after the opening of these irrigation projects. We recognize that sugar beets work very well in dry climates where you have irrigation available. But one thing that was lacking is they needed people to work the fields. And that's where two of the most prominent groups of the south side of Billings come into play. One, of course, is the Germans from Russia, which I'll talk about. Edward Gillette, the state treasurer of Wyoming, pointed out, conditions are such on most of our reclamation projects that only a foreigner with a large family used to the plainest living and disregarding the education of his children can be successful. If you're not familiar with the Germans from Russia, they're very prominent in North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado. And what they were is they were basically Germans that were invited by Catherine the Great to be agriculturalists in the Black Sea and Volga regions. They were there for over 100 years, but over time, all of the promises of religious freedom and prejudice and having to serve in the military were reversed. And basically, they started coming back either to Germany, but many of them came to the U.S. and they were very attractive as immigrants because they knew how to farm and they were already familiar with sugar beets. So in 1907, the sugar company in Billings began shipping in laborers to work the sugar beet fields. 400 men arrived, followed by another train load of about 300. Now, most of these were going to be transient workers. They were coming in to do the seeding, the feeding, the weeding, and things like that, and then the harvesting at the end. But most of these families, the men were accompanied by their families. The newspaper said they are mostly German Russians and they come from the settlements of Nebraska. They are said to be the most skilled beet field workers in the world. The sugar company now has brought them into the Yellowstone River Valley early in order to provide labor for the farmers at the time of the planting. Some of these people would go back to places like Lincoln, Nebraska or Kansas, but the sugar factory started providing incentives to try to keep them to winter over the year, to try to establish populations. And the fact that they came with large families helped them to settle into the south side of Billings. So in 1908, another group of 500 Germans from Russia were recruited into the Yellowstone River Valley. And if you're familiar with the area of Laurel, Park City, Billings, the German from Russian populations are pretty significant yet to this day. We have one over there. Our person who I just found out introduced us lived on the south side. Again, we went out and interviewed members of the community. Local papers at the time noted that migrants were willing to work wages and jobs that the other Americans would not. So again, incentive to bring outside foreign labor into a region to do this hard work. We learned that Zenda Cook's family came to Nebraska in 1894. Zenda's family, then the Kaisers, came as seasonal migrants to Yellowstone and Billings in 1906 to 1909, and they permanently settled in the Billings area in 1909. Darrell Ehrlich's family, and these are a couple of his photographs, they came to Billings and Laurel by 1912. The family names include Ehrlich, Siebel, Manweiler. His great-grandparents spoke both German, Low German, and also Russian. So actually, this is gross for early morning, but one of the conversations we had was Zenda and Darrell sharing some of their more traditional foods and drinks, which they still like to prepare. Blood sausage made from their own beer, smoked fish, smoked carp, dark rye bread, cucumbers and tomato salad, potatoes, rhubarb, head cheese, liverwurst. I don't know if I'm going over their house. Thank you. And a lot of these ethnic groups, as you know, they come in, they look European, obviously, and it's much more easily accepted in some ways in America that way. But obviously in 1917 and 1918 with the war, a lot of the German speaking people, including the Germans from Russia, had to temper their language. This is a transitional period in American history, the book burnings of German books and such. Until this point, German was the most taught language in the schools. After World War I, Spanish would be the #1 language. So, and then in the 1920s, the sugar factory again needed more labor. I just love these little cartoons. So throughout the 20th century, Mexican and Mexican-American migrant laborers were instrumental in the success of the sugar beet industry in the northern Great Plains. They were recruited from Texas, California, Colorado, Mexico. These workers became known as Los Boleros, the sugar beet workers. And I'm going to move through this quick here. So one of the cool things that the sugar beet factory did, they built housing. So again, this labor group also moved to the rhythm of the harvest and the seed planting and stuff like that. So the sugar factory had to figure out a way to keep these migrant laborers over the year. And they built a large housing complex on the west side of the sugar beet grounds, built basically an adobe town, 12 by 18 units. Each adobe had 1 bedroom, a wood stove, an outhouse. There was a water pump. Every 5 houses, residents grew their own gardens and livestock. And the sugar factory also provided, to agree, financial support for the Mexican school and part of what was called the Americanization process, basically helping these Spanish speakers to become bilingual and become part of the Billings community. So during the Depression economy of the 1930s, there was obviously an atmosphere of opposition to the migrant laborers, but obviously we had to figure out something. We even brought German German POWs and Italian POWs into Montana to work the sugar beets. So by the 1940s, the Bracero Club program was established by the federal government, which allowed Mexican nationals to come into the United States to help harvest the sugar beets. And I just wanted to show you this picture. You mentioned Little Flower Church earlier. The Hispanics of the Southside originally attended the Church of the Little Flower Catholic Church with a lot of Germans from Russia. So it must have been kind of chaotic, with all the different languages and such. But in 1953, the Diocese of Great Falls created a separate church for the Spanish-speaking populations of Billings. They purchased the dance hall or roller skating rink next to South Park and created Our Lady of Guadalupe and held most of the services in Spanish. Oddly enough, Reverend James Kitson, their first pastor, had to hitch a ride in a sugar beet truck from Isham just to get there. So, and the Hispanic influence is still quite prevalent in Billings today. Cinco de Mayo, we have events at the South Park that go back quite a ways, like the Easter egg hunt. And finally, these are some of the sugar beet kids today. Judge Pedro Hernandez, a judge in Billings for over 40 years. Jim Ronquillo, the city councilman on the right there, who was still a prominent community organizer in Billings. And then we have our own rock star in Billings. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is Chan Romero with his gold record. And I'm going to date everybody. Who knows the song, The Hippie Hippie Shake? There you go. So Chan was to be the next Hispanic rock star after Richie Valens' death. So all of these folks are sugar beet kids. So they became instrumental part of Billings' life. And then finally, the Southside residents, where we worked with Riverstone Health and Healthy by Design, came up with this as their new slogan, and it's everywhere. I even had it on my t-shirt yesterday. Southside of Billings, the bright side of the tracks. Okay, thank you.